So, we all just know that the crows are the better part of this, right? Hello interwebs and welcome to my review of Shadow and Bone Season 1. I know I'm a little bit behind on getting to this show. I had so many other shows that I was reviewing and discussing and talking about that it took me a little while to get to this one. And I wasn't even entirely sure that I wanted to review it, but I honestly really, after watching it, had so many thoughts on it because it kind of intersected with a lot of my other thoughts that I've been thinking about with other recent shows like Falcon and the Winter Soldier and things like that, that I knew I'm going to be doing a bigger video that critiques this show and sort of brings up some issues and ideas that I had with the show over on my main channel. But I also really liked the show a lot too. There was so much that I loved. So I kind of wanted to do a review to at least kind of express the things that I loved about it and sort of be on record of me saying like, no, this show is actually kind of fun and great. So that when I do talk about some of my criticisms of it, that I do, that I make it clear that, like, I like this show despite some of my issues with it. And I will be expressing some of those issues within this review here. The other thing, too, before I get into the review proper, I should say is that I have not read the books that this is based on. However, I have done some research into some of the differences that they made between the show and the books and things like that. Some of the changes that they made, sometimes for the better, sometimes for the worse. We'll get into that in this review. As well as the fact that they combined the sort of main series of the Grishaverse that this sort of main plot is focused on with a duology that came out long after the main trilogy of books focusing on the crows. And so this is sort of a rendition adaptation of the main books in the series and then kind of a prequel of those Crows books because those Crows books were much more beloved than the actual trilogy itself. But obviously the main trilogy is sort of the main thrust of the story. So I think the writers of the show did a smart job of sort of combining these two things, the more beloved series and then the sort of main impetus for the story as well. And I think that they dovetailed them really, really interestingly and well and sort of fleshed out these characters in a really, really cool way. So we're going to get into all of that. But let's focus my review on the main part of this show, the main trilogy, the main plot thrust that we have going on here, because I think that this was actually a really cool story and concept. So basic idea of this universe is that there are people with these magical powers that are Grisha, sort of like magicians without magicians. They're sort of demonized within society, and there's all these different warring factions and worlds, and only within one country, Ravika, I forget the exact name of the country, are these people, they're not necessarily beloved, but they're sort of accepted, protected in the army. So whenever a Grisha is found, they're sort of brought into the army and they're sort of protected, but they're still kind of looked down upon by society as a whole. Also in this universe, there's this huge thing called the Fold, which is this dark expanse that expands across this sort of middle of the world that sort of separates off all these different nations from each other. And in this fold, there are these dark creatures that if anyone tries to enter, a lot of people die. You can cross it, but it's very dangerous, and most people that go through don't make it out. And this was created by an ancient Grisha that made the Fold, and there's sort of this like a mystical belief that there will be a sun summoner that will come and fix the Fold and sort of reunite the entirety of the world again. And obviously our main character, Alina, happens to be the Sun Summoner, and this causes her to get stuck in all these events that she did not wish to be a part of because she did not want to be the Sun Summoner. And that's the sort of main plot of the series, and I have to say, I genuinely enjoyed it. It is sort of your standard archetypical chosen one hero narrative where this girl gets thrust into a situation that she wasn't really aware of, didn't want to have, and it sort of affects all the things in her life, but eventually she comes into her own power, comes to accept herself and fight back against the bad guy, the big Dark Lord of the series, who happens to be the Darkling, General Kiergan, I think is what they name him within the show, and the show gives him a much more interesting backstory than apparently in the books. Again, having not read the books, but seeing critiques, apparently he is much more interesting than he is in the books. But I think this is all well presented because I think Jessica May Lee is sort of very charismatic performance. I think she does a really great job sort of drawing a little bit more out of this character than is necessarily on the page. I think she gives a really strong performance, and you can kind of see her sort of push and pull between sort of coming to accept her own as the Sun Summoner. And I think that that's really, really wonderful. This gets into one of the interesting conversations, though, that I've seen surrounding the show, in that in the book, this character was actually portrayed and written to be white, but they cast an Asian woman in the main character role for the show, which honestly I think is a really great idea. I mean, I love seeing this sort of like casting where we get to see more diverse characters brought into a storyline that wasn't necessarily diverse to begin with, and something that the author herself when she wrote the book, after she wrote the book, recognized, especially when she wrote the Crow's duology, which was much more intentionally diverse because she saw that her main book trilogy was fairly whitewashed and didn't have a lot of like diverse characters within it. So I like them sort of retconning that into the character. One of the interesting pieces of this conversation, though, is by making her an Asian character, they kind of also added in the fact that one of the other nations around here is basically sort of analogous to, Asian countries. But this did bring up an interesting conversation, though, around the fact that because of that, a lot of characters in the show espouse racism and use Asian slurs against this girl. And I've seen kind of two sides of this issue, where some people say, like, oh, adding racism into the story that wasn't necessarily there, especially now at a time when there's sort of a major discussion around Asian hate within the United States, isn't necessarily a great look and can come across as very offensive. But the other side of the conversation that I've seen people having is people saying that, like, no, this is actually depicting what that's like, and it sort of shows the intersection of identity that a character like this has, where she feels like she's from, she was born in this country, she's from this country, she's never known what it's like to be a Shu, which is sort of the analogous Asian country that she's sort of descended from. So she is part of this country, but no one really accepts her as that, and it also intersects with her identity as becoming the Sun Summoner, becoming a Grisha, a magic user. It also has its own stigma. So she's getting all these different sort of intersections within her identity, and I've seen a lot of people actually praise that it sort of presents that. For my own money, and I'll talk about this in a sort of larger video, at least touch upon it. For my own money, again, I'm not an Asian person, so I'm not the biggest voice that you should be listening to this. I actually think it's kind of interesting and works pretty well, because it kind of subverts one of the major problems that when we see stories in fantasy worlds where it's like, oh, people with powers are sort of seen as otherized and there's stigma against them, especially in a story like this, because a lot of the Grisha stigmatization comes from the fact that the Darkling created the Fold, and that is a thing that a lot of people would understandably kind of be pissed off about, because the Fold is a terrible thing that happened to the world. Now, there was Grisha hate before then, as we see within the show, but that's a lot where that stems from. And I kind of get a little bit uncomfortable in some stories where I see that racism is stemming from like an actual like historical event that was like used by powers and sort of this mystical thing, because in a lot of cases, not always, there is some sort of sometimes political motivation for racial stigmatization. I feel like racism isn't necessarily comes from like a logical place of like, oh, your people did this one bad thing, but sort of gets extrapolated out into like the entire population of people, and it sort of like creates like a justified reason behind racism. I'm not necessarily saying that overall, but it kind of, I see this a lot in some fantasy literature. I think the most overt example of this is Bright, kind of has this as well. The movie Bright, which wasn't a great movie, by the way, but they kind of like extrapolated orcs in that universe to be people of color, black people specifically. But then they also said that like the orcs became orcs because they worked for the Dark Lord. And so it was like, oh, so you're saying that it's kind of the orcs' fault for being orcs and they kind of deserve it. It just has, it's not explicit, it's not the intention, but it kind of has that undercurrent there. And I think that this show kind of subverts that in an interesting way, because it has this intersection of identity. It's saying like, no, like actual racism for racial features exists in this world that is independent of sort of these mystical powers and mystical ideas, and it sort of allows them to sort of tell both tales and tell both stories. And I think that was kind of a smart move for my money. And I think there's a lot more nuance to that topic that, number one, I can't bring as a white person, but also that I want to have in some other videos that sort of intersect with some other things that I want to talk about within this show. But for my money, I think it's not perfectly done, and there's certainly a larger conversation to have about it, but I found it to be, I find it kind of to eschew some of the major issues that I would have with this type of show when they sort of do this type of thing. The other things, too, within this main stories, I have to say, I really loved the Darkling. I think he was a very charismatic villain. I love the actor. I've seen him in a few other things as well. But I think he brings this sort of menacingness, but he also brings this sort of like suave charm that I think worked for sort of like, I actually wasn't entirely sure that he was going to be the bad guy at the beginning of the show. He's not by no means the most, in-depth sort of evil character that I've seen in fantasy literature, but neither is he like Voldemort, who is just like clear evil and there's no redeeming quality about him. Like, no, I actually kind of understand his plight. This gets into some some of the stuff that I talked about in Falcon and the Winter Soldier, by the way, as well, with the fact that I actually understand the Darkling's plight. Like, his whole thing is to stop the stigmatization and hate and trauma that Grisha faced, and that's actually an admirable goal. And sort of like, he's this revolutionary figure who wants to tear down society, and the show seems more interested in attacking him and saying like, oh no, this guy's going too far, this guy's evil, than like recognizing the system in which he sits and recognizing that the system is causing this. Like, the king is right there. The king perpetuates not only racism against Grisha, but racism against Shu and things like that. But the show never really adequately addresses that. It sort of says, oh no, this revolutionary figure who we kind of understand and are sympathetic. There's a whole like opening bit of an episode where we sympathize with him. We're more interested in critiquing him. So that's a bit disappointing. It's something I talked about in another video I did on my main channel about Falcon and the Winter Soldier, so you can check out that video. Yeah, it just kind of gets in this sort of like thing of like, oh, we're more interested in critiquing this person for going too far over an understandable issue that they're confronting, rather than actually addressing the system as a whole. And this also gets back into the racism idea, because the racism of the Shu is never really drawn into towards like critique of a system. It sort of said like, it's individual racist or racist towards the Shu. So again, it kind of feeds all into that idea, which was a bit disappointing, but not necessarily exclusive to this show. So I really like the Darkling. I actually found him to be kind of charismatic and interesting, and I'm sort of excited and hopeful that they will be able to make him even grayer as a moral character going into the future. I hope that they don't make him just pure evil going forward. But we'll see. I think that'll be interesting to see where that goes. The other part of this too is Mal. Mal being the boyfriend of the main character. I think he was like the sweetest boyfriend ever. I know that in the books he's apparently a bit of an a-hole, but the show sort of lightened him up, and I think they did a great job. Every time I was like, oh, you adorable little soft boy, I love you. You are absolutely so incredibly sweet. So great job on that front as well. However, all that being said, the true treat of this show though wasn't really the main plot, and it kind of mirrors the books as well, because the main characters that I really fell in love with were the Crows. All of the Crows and their sort of like heist storyline here, where they were going to steal the Sun Summoner, which again is a prequel for their characters in the book. Again, having not read the book, but this is what I'm told. I really enjoyed that. I'm also reading Brandon Sanderson's book Mistborn right now, and I'm starting to realize that fantasy heist might be a new favorite genre of mine. I really seem to like fantasy heists quite a bit. It's just a lot of fun, and these characters, again, so much more diverse, so much more interesting. Their world is so much more, nuanced and depthful, and a lot more interactions going on here between the characters. You see some really interesting arcs. Jesper, I think, is a really cool character. I love him. He's sort of this sort of like overly obsessed with his looks gay guy who likes to gamble and do morally ambiguous things, but that's sort of, it's kind of a trope stock character, but it's a trope stock character that I kind of always love to see. Like, I will never not enjoy that type of character, the sort of very flamboyant, very like playful guy who sort of like is able to like trick people and do cool things. So a lot of fun with him. I love seeing all the arcs for the Crows and their sort of adventure with the heist. Easily probably the best setup here, and also the most diverse characters within the show. I mean, the show itself did a much better job of adding diversity to it, but the Crows themselves, from what I've read, are already fairly diverse. We have, an Indian woman. We have a man who has a disability and walks with a cane. We have a black man. We have, so many different diverse characters within the show that really come out in the Crows storyline, and I think that they probably have the best arc and story throughout this entire series. There's also another storyline that I can't even remember the main character's name, that was sort of about a Grisha who was kidnapped and taken by this guy who was a Grisha hunter and was very racist against Grisha, but then they start falling in love, and it was a kind of nice and kind of well done, but I kind of saw where it was going. It's like, oh, this guy overcoming his racism, but there's going to be ups and downs because he's not going to fully come over his racism. It works. It's not bad, but it was sort of like, I didn't really care. Like I said, I don't even really remember the main character's name in that storyline. I feel bad for doing a review, but I'm just being honest. Like, it was a fine storyline. Looks like it probably is setting up to go somewhere more interesting in future seasons of the show, and maybe the character's super interesting in the books, but for me, I thought the storyline was fairly like wrote, and I'm like, whenever it was on screen, I'm like, oh, this is good, but this romance plot thing, but can we get to the more interesting stuff? So maybe it'll go somewhere better in the book. It's not bad, it's just kind of there, and I was sort of like, okay, that's fine, cool with it. The only other critique that I would have of this show is that I never really got a sense of the larger world around the sort of main country that we were dealing with here, like why there was this big army, why they were fighting each other. I got that there was like kind of a civil war happening because of the rift the Fold caused between their country, but it never really felt like it was fully fleshed out. We were very much more focused on these characters and sort of their internal drama, which is interesting, especially in the Crow's case. But I would have liked a little bit of a grander sense of the way the world fits together and sort of like what was going on in the larger world to sort of have a little bit more context for everything. Because I feel like a lot of the context that I got was sort of me going out and doing the research as opposed to the show sort of explaining it to me in kind of in a comprehensible way. It never got confusing within the show. I was never like lost with like how the world was set up and how things worked. But the world seems like it's such an interesting world that I was kind of disappointed that we didn't get it fleshed out a little bit further to sort of see like what was beyond the borders, like why were these people fighting each other, what was sort of going on that caused this sort of schism between these different countries and this civil war between these people, and who are the people trying to grab power within this. I never really got a great sense of any of that, and so I feel like that is one of the knocks against the show. But hopefully as the show continues and expands outward, we'll start to see more of that. So that might just be a thing that's being reserved for later seasons, sort of keep this first season comprehensible. But it was something that I was intrigued, and maybe that is to the show's benefit, that I'm like actually excited and eager to learn more. I mean, I'm definitely going to be reading the Crow's books now at some point when I have the free time too. So overall, I think this was a great show. I think there are some conversations within the show, like around racism and representation of revolutionaries and race and things like that are interesting, that are kind of happening around the show itself, that I don't think there are any easy answers to, nor do I think I'm the best voice to sort of poke at them. But I do think that the show sort of raises interesting questions about representation and racism and race, but also being kind of an interesting story as well, and as well as kind of having a very interesting subset of characters that aren't the main plot. And sort of I think the adaptation of this and the clever ways that they adapted this as sort of a prequel and pseudo sort of like adaptation of the main plot line is really, really clever, in my opinion. So a lot of really interesting things around the show, not done perfectly, but I do think that it was done in a way that sparks conversation. And I think that shows like this that spark conversation are well worth the time. So it's not a show that sort of ends conversations, sort of, says right or wrong. And I don't think there is a right or wrong around the conversations within and without of the show. But I think overall, I think it's well worth talking about. And that's all I can really ask for a TV show, is to entertain me and make me think. So overall, Shadow and Bone, not a perfect show. I have some problems with it. But overall, I think it is a really strong show that has me excited to not only see future seasons, but read the books as well. But I'd love to hear all of your thoughts down in the comments below. Did you like this show? Do you have thoughts on it? I'd love to hear all of that. Don't forget, I have my main channel, Jessie Gender, where I do bigger video essays. Like I said, I'll probably be doing a video essay on this show and how it intersects with some other ideas that I've been thinking about as well. So that'll be over on my main channel, but don't forget to subscribe to this one for more reviews and me just geeking out and nerding out here. I also have a Patreon page where you can support me and get yourself cool perks like your name in videos, and also watch alongs with me of different movies and TV shows that are exclusive to my Patreons. But beyond all of that, I hope that you, as always, live long and stay sexy.